Um, I have to say that I'm amazed and kind of encouraged by the turnout here. Because I say that because when I was in college, when I was your age, the chances of me showing up at an event like this were approximately 0. And not because I disbelieved in what Cru does or believes or what it's all about, I just didn't care. I lived my life in 2 separate worlds. The main world that I was concentrating on, that I was focused on, was the life of my career. All I ever wanted to do since I was a little kid, since the time I can remember, is fly jets. And I pursued that vigorously. I went to the Naval Academy, I majored in aerospace engineering, went into the Marine Corps, went through naval flight training, and became a Marine single-seat, single-engine attack pilot. I couldn't think of anything better to do. I did that for 8 years, got out of the Marine Corps, got hired by Delta Airlines, and I've been a commercial airline pilot to this day, still flying jets. So that was my focus. That's all I cared about. There was a parallel world, though, that was my faith life. I was brought up in a Christian home. I actually didn't read a Bible for myself until I was a junior in high school, but I was kind of enthralled with it. I joined a Bible study, and a year later in that Bible study, I met the girl I would eventually end up marrying. So that worked out. But we were both kind of in the same boat. She was an athlete. All I cared about was flying, and we just kind of lived our life in an apathetic way toward our faith until we had kids. And then once we had kids, we decided we better get serious about it and maybe bring them up the way we were brought up, so we started going to church regularly. And that's where I was. I had 2 kids. I was 31 years old when the 2 worlds I just described to you collided at 35,000 feet over the plains of Kansas at about 3 o'clock in the morning on a red-eye from Phoenix to Cincinnati. I was flying with a guy who was an avowed atheist, and I had never in my life even met anyone that was claimed to be an atheist. I'd certainly never talked to anybody about religious issues like that. And so we got into this big discussion. I was throwing Bible verses at him, and he just said, I don't care what the Bible says. It's a thousands-of-year-old book about myths and legends. What do I care? I didn't really know what to say. And so I don't know what prompted it. I don't remember what I said to bring this on, but he looked at me at one point, I'll never forget it. He said, okay, Bob, tell me why. Why do you believe in God? And this is what I told him. Awkward, huh? Yeah, I had absolutely no clue how to answer that question. I had always known that I believed, but I couldn't tell anybody why. And in that moment, for that instant, I became a skeptic because I started to wonder if I believed. I wanted to know answers. I did not want to be the person who we all know, whether it's on the atheist side or on the religious side, who just believes what they believe because their mommy and daddy brought them up that way. That was not going to be me. So I started researching it, looking into it, and for the better part of my life since then, that's what I've been concentrating on. And that's what brings me here tonight to talk to you guys about how to answer that question. Now, before I do that, I already see some of the big eyes. I've seen this before when I tell that story. People look at me and they're like, wait a second. You guys are supposed to be up there flying the airplane and you're arguing about religion? So, relax. Most people read right over it. You probably just didn't even notice. But right at the end of Genesis, it says, on the 8th day, God invented the autopilot. So, we're good. Seriously, how will I answer that question? And the way I would answer it is a real simple answer. What I would say is that I believe in God because I think God offers the most logical, reasonable explanation for the way we find the world. Now, there's a lot that goes into that. There's a lot of reasons I say that. We only have time to concentrate on 3 tonight, so that's what I'm going to do. The 3 things we're going to talk about are, first, I believe in God because I know the universe had a beginning, and anything that begins to exist has to have a beginning. beginner to make it happen. It has to have a cause. Second, I believe in God because the universe is designed. And it's designed to such a degree that we can't just write it off to random chance. Design like that requires a designer. And third, I believe in God because I believe in objective moral values and rules and laws. And I know that you can't get a law without a lawmaker. So, those are the 3 points we're going to concentrate on tonight. And here we go. First point. The universe had a beginning. Why do I say that? Well, as hard as it is for us to believe at the turn of the 20th century, no one had ever heard of Albert Einstein. He was an obscure, eccentric German scientist who was trying to find a way to understand and complete Isaac Newton's laws of motion. Everybody used Newton's laws. They worked just fine. They were very accurate. And everyone accepted them, but everyone also knew that there was a missing part to Newton's laws, that we didn't know how gravity worked. We could measure it, but we didn't know where it came from or what caused it. And so that was Einstein's goal, was to figure that out. He wanted to rewrite physics to understand how gravity worked. And so he came up with this novel idea. What he said was that there was this thing he called a space-time fabric, which is kind of bizarre, but think of the 3 dimensions of space and time knitted together in a fabric. Stick with me. He also said that matter and energy were co-related to space and time, co-relative. That's why it's called the theory of relativity. And so what he said was that gravity was just our observation of how these things work together. Now, I was a Marine, okay? I don't understand Einstein's theory of relativity. But here's an analogy that I can understand. Maybe this will help you. Think of a giant rubber trampoline, and on one side of the trampoline you put a big giant bowling ball, and on the other side you put a marble. What happens? Well, the trampoline mat, the fabric, is deflected by the bowling ball so that the marble rolls toward it. And that's all Einstein said gravity was a deflection in the space-time fabric. That was his explanation for gravity. And because light travels through the space-time, he had a prediction. He said, light going past a massive object will deflect and curve on that space-time. Now, how do you figure that out? I don't know. I don't know the math behind it. But 4 years later, in 1919, there was a total solar eclipse, just like we had last year. And during the eclipse, astronomers could see stars just near the disk, the edge of the sun, and they could measure deflection in the light that they could only see during a total eclipse. And they saw that the light was deflected exactly the way Einstein said it would. So the world of physics was in upheaval. This was a brand new thing, and it was right. It worked. The predictions came true. Now, it all worked just fine, but Einstein had something hidden in there that he didn't really tell a lot of people. This was what it was. The only way the math worked, the equations that he used to describe this physics, was if that space-time fabric was continuously expanding. Einstein knew that wasn't true. Everybody knew that wasn't true. Kind of like everybody used to know the world was flat. Einstein, because he knew the world, or the universe, was static and eternal. What does that mean? It means, think of the universe as just a giant blob. And the paradigm at the time was that it was static, it didn't change. Things moved around inside it, but the universe itself didn't change. And it was eternal. It had always been here, and it would always be here. So, Einstein put what he called a cosmological constant in his equations. The only reason he put it in there was to cancel out this idea of an expansion, because he knew it wasn't true. 10 years later, another scientist named Edwin Hubble contacted Einstein and said, hey, you got to look at my data here. Everything that Hubble looked at, every direction from the Earth, every star, every galaxy that he looked at, demonstrated what we now call redshift. The light that we saw from those stars was shifted toward the red end of the spectrum, which is physics, and I don't know how that works physics either, but what it meant was that all those objects were moving away from us, everything. Einstein looked at his data and realized that Hubble was right, that the universe really was expanding. He took the cosmological constant out of his equations and later called it the greatest blunder of his career. Now, why would he say that? Why would Einstein have put the cosmological constant in there in the first place? It wasn't because he wanted to be like everybody else and say the universe was static and eternal. He was a maverick thinker. He wanted to be original. The reason he put it in there is because Einstein was an atheist. And he knew that if the universe was continuously expanding, that meant that if you ran the clock backwards, at some point you come to a point of infinite density and infinitesimally small point, where all matter, energy, space, and time, remember those are all connected, all came into existence at the same time. And he knew that if that had happened, that there must be something outside matter, energy, space, and time that caused it to happen. He put the cosmological constant in there to deny the idea of there being a God. Now, maybe you don't like this idea of the expanding universe. Some Christians don't. But if you don't, that's okay. All it is a scientific explanation for what we call a cosmological argument. A cosmological argument is that anything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. The second premise there, the universe began to exist. That's all Einstein showed. And if you don't like the science of that, that's okay, because 2,200 years before Einstein, Aristotle reasoned his way to the same idea. Aristotle said that he observed that the world was constantly changing. To a philosopher, that's called motion. You know, water, icebergs melt, and the water goes into the oceans and evaporates and becomes clouds, and it rains, and that goes to plants, and the plants die, and they decay, and the animals eat, and it goes on and on and on. The world is constantly in motion. And so Aristotle reasoned that if you have motion, something has to kick it off. This stand here won't just move unless I push it. So there had to be something at the beginning of all this stuff, all this motion that was going on in the universe that caused it to start. He called it the unmoved mover. This is 2,200 years before Einstein. In fact, Aristotle reasoned that it couldn't just be not moving, it had to be unmovable. Now remember, Aristotle is in a polytheistic culture where they believe in all kinds of gods. But what he reasoned was that this unmoved mover was something very much like a singular, unitary God. And so that was 2,200 years before Einstein. A few thousand years before that, somebody wrote these words: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So, what's the most reasonable explanation for all this? The most reasonable explanation is that if everything comes into existence at a certain point, then something outside of that must have caused it to happen. That's what we call God, Thomas Aquinas said. Well, somebody named Fred Hoyle, another astronomer, labeled this whole expansion of the universe the Big Bang. He did it as a term of derision. He hated the Big Bang. Fred Hoyle was an atheist just like Einstein. He went to his death denying that the universe was expanding for that reason. And part of the way he did that, the reason he called it the Big Bang, was to kind of mock the idea of a God, because this was a random, chaotic explosion, is what he wanted to sound like. Well, what we've learned since then is that Fred Hoyle was way, way wrong. This was not a random, chaotic explosion. This was a well-designed, immaculately designed happening from the very first nanosecond that it happened. And this is what we call, atheist astronomers actually came up with this name, the anthropic principle. It's our second point, that the universe was designed. Anthropos is the Greek word for man, and the point of this is that there are hundreds of factors that have to be exactly the way they are for human life, conscious human life like us, to be possible. And so what it says is that it looks like the universe was designed with man in mind. Now, like I said, there's hundreds of these, but I want you to watch this video about just 2 of them.
The laws of physics are balanced on a razor's edge for life to occur. For example, if you didn't have something like gravity that pulled matter together, you would never get planets, you wouldn't get stars, you wouldn't get any complex organisms. If you didn't have the strong nuclear force, there would be nothing to hold protons and neutrons together in the nucleus. And so you wouldn't have any atoms, so no chemistry. If you didn't have the electromagnetic force, you would have no bonding between chemicals. You'd have no light, and the list goes on. So you need all these sorts of fundamental principles have to be in place in order for life to occur. Wipe out one of those principles, wipe out one of those laws, no life.
Strobel learned that life also hinges on the precise strengths and relative values of many different physical constants. One example of this fine-tuning is the force of gravity.
Imagine a ruler divided up into 1-inch increments and then stretched across the entire universe, a distance of some 14 billion light years. For the purposes of illustration, the ruler represents the possible range for gravity. In other words, the setting for the strength of gravity could have been anywhere along the ruler, but it just happens to be situated in exactly the right place so that life is possible. Now, if you were to change the force of gravity by moving the setting just 1 inch compared to the entire width of the universe, the effect on life would be catastrophic.
No large-scale life forms could exist. Anything that was more than the size of a pea would be completely crushed. So you might be able to get life of a very, very primitive sort, such as bacteria, but you could never get conscious observers.
The strength of gravity is just one of at least 30 separate parameters that must be finely tuned to produce a life-sustaining universe. Another example is the cosmological constant.
The cosmological constant describes the expansion speed of space in the universe. If space expands too quickly, then the universe will spread out so quickly that material objects can't form. So you can't get stars and galaxies and planets and the types of things that we, of course, take for granted in our universe.
Physicists have determined that the cosmological constant is fine-tuned to 1 part in 100 million billion 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 billion. Such precision has been compared to traveling hundreds of miles into space, then throwing a dart at the Earth and hitting a bullseye measuring 1/trillionth of an inch in diameter, an area less than the width of a single atom.
Just consider those 2 parameters, gravity and the cosmological constant. Their level of fine-tuning is to a precision of 1 part in 100 million trillion 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 trillion. I mean, that's like 1 atom in the entire known universe.
Yeah, those are just the constants and laws. He said there were 30 some of them. But there are other things, the relationships between things, the ratios between things, the physical location of things have to be exactly where they are, or there would be no life possible. The galaxy that we're in. We have to be in a spiral arm galaxy. And we can't be in one of the spiral arms because there's too much radiation. It would kill off any life. We have to be in between arms of a spiral arm galaxy. We have to be orbiting around a star of a certain type and a certain age. Too early in its cycle, it's too unstable. Too late, the same thing. Too hot or too cool, no life. We have to be on a planet that's just the right distance from that star. If we're too far away, it's too cold for life. If we're too close, it's too hot. We have to have a moon that's exactly the right size, that controls the tides and continental drift, that churns up nutrients from the oceans, that lets life be sustainable. We have to have a planet tilted at exactly 23.5 degrees, or we get uneven heating too much. We have to have uneven heating for weather and a water cycle to sustain life. But if it's not tilted enough, the uneven heating is not enough. If it's tilted too much, it's too radical. We have to have a ratio of oxygen and nitrogen, exactly what it is. Carbon dioxide to water vapor, the mass of a proton, the spin of an electron. It goes on and on and on. And I think it's ironic that the two factors that he talked about in the video, gravity and the cosmological constant, one of them is fine-tuned through what you heard, what he said. The other one, cosmological constant, there is a cosmological constant, it turns out. But it does exactly the opposite of what Einstein said it did. Because the stretching of the universe has to be exactly where it is. Now, those are all the factors for life to be possible. But what about life itself? We don't have time to get into this tonight, but I want you to understand about DNA. Every computer program that you ever use, no matter how fancy or sophisticated it is, when it talks to the machine that it's running, all it does is ones and zeros, 2 digits. DNA uses a 4-digit code. So it's vastly more complex and efficient than any computer you've ever used. Bill Gates said, DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. And so this is the design that we see in the universe. Believe me, we could talk about this for days. But what's the most reasonable explanation for that? If you see design to that degree, it looks like somebody designed it. If you saw a book of software, like a digital code in every cell in your body, sitting on a desk, you wouldn't think, wow, that's pretty wild how that software code just came together on its own. You would just, by normal human intuition, realize that a human put that together, a mind put that together. So what we've talked about so far. We've identified that there is some kind of cause for the beginning of the universe. We've identified that there is a designer for that universe. And what have we learned about him? We've learned that it cannot be made of matter or energy. It cannot be inside space. It cannot be bound by time. Remember, matter, energy, space, and time all came into existence at the same point. Whatever caused it was outside of those. It must be powerful. It must be unchangeable. It must be intelligent to write a computer code like that. And that means it has to be personal. And when we bring persons into the mix, we come to our third argument, the moral argument. Because when we're talking about relationships between people, between persons, there is a moral dimension to that, always. Every single person in this room recognizes that across cultures, universally, there are things that we all recognize as moral values and rules, and we act as if they're true, even if we say that there's no reason for them. Now, I know you talked about this last week, about relativism with truth. Well, here we're just talking about moral truth. It's the same thing. Everyone in this room knows that you can't torture toddlers for fun. Everyone in this room knows that courage and honesty are good, that you can't murder innocent people, that you shouldn't steal your neighbor's iPhone, that rape is wrong, that we have rights that are endowed to us just because we're human beings. They're called human rights for a reason. So, where did these come from? Well, they couldn't be individually chosen, just like truth can't be individually chosen. I can't suddenly decide, well, I think torturing toddlers for fun is okay, and then we just agree to disagree. No, that's ridiculous, and I think anyone who is thinking clearly about it knows that. But what some people will say is, well, maybe individuals can't make up their own morality, but we can get together as a culture and have a consensus about what's morally right and wrong. Well, that doesn't work either. There was a cultural consensus in the 1930s in Germany that Hitler was a great guy. There was a cultural consensus in the South in this country in the mid-1800s that slavery was just fine. You see, cultural consensus doesn't lead us to moral truth. In fact, reformers, social warriors like Martin Luther King Jr. are fighting against the consensus because they know the consensus is wrong, but they're in the minority. So, this was the argument that drove C.S. Lewis from being an atheist to being a theist, to believing in God. Here's what he said. My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? I could have just given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, my argument against God collapsed too. For my argument depended on saying that the world really is unjust, not simply that it didn't happen to please my private fancies. So, the moral law is there. We all recognize it, we all live by it, even if we try to pretend otherwise. What's the most reasonable explanation for a law? Said a lawmaker put it in place. Now, we've only looked at 3 things, but I want you to understand that given enough time, there is a vast array of arguments that point to the existence of God, that theism is true. If you claim that God exists, you have good ground to stand on. If somebody wants to argue one of these points I made tonight, or one of the other ones that you see up on the screen behind me, have at it. But that doesn't mean, if you defeat one of them, if you don't like one of them, if you argue against it, there's a whole bunch more that you have to deal with. It's called a cumulative case. And here's what I want you to understand about this. What I said at the beginning, the reason I believe in God is because I believe God is the most reasonable explanation for the world we find ourselves in. And I want you to understand that everything I've talked about tonight is just observations from the world, from science, from philosophy, about design, about morality. These are things we all just observe from the world. But every one of them, and you can look these references up for yourself, every one of them is perfectly consistent with what the Bible says about the way the world is. And if you know the definition of truth, it's this. When you believe something that matches the way the world actually is, then what you believe is true. The Bible matches the way the world is. All I've argued for tonight is theism, the existence of God himself. In order to get to Christian theism, you need to do some other stuff. You need to talk about scriptural reliability. You need to talk about the historicity of Jesus, the historicity of the resurrection. That's for another time. But tonight, what I've argued is that theism is true. And that gives us some challenges. I think every single person in this room needs to understand that you cannot let your presuppositions drive the conclusions you allow yourself to make. You can't let the way you were brought up or what you've always thought drive what you believe. You have to examine the evidence for yourself. So, if you're a skeptic, what's the source of your skepticism? Look at the evidence and see what it says. Do it with an open mind. If you're a Christian, are you lazy like I was? Or do you own your faith? Do you just drift along? Or if somebody asked you the question I was asked, would you have an answer? Listen, there's no question, if you believe this, there is no question you should be afraid to face. No skeptic should ever be left with silence. And if anyone ever asks you why you believe in God, you should be fully prepared to give them heaven. That's it.